Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to open this event of the University of Oklahoma Center for the Americas entitled Archeoastronomy of the Inca Empire with Professor Stephen Gullberg. I'd like to, I will introduce him in just a moment. I do want to make just a couple of programming comments at the beginning, and I'll repeat these at the end of some other upcoming events, and also just give people who are logging in time to get in. There is a very interesting event being co-sponsored by the Center for Brazil Studies, or sponsored by the Center for Brazil Studies and co-sponsored by the Center for the Americas, in which George Lima, who is a human rights officer of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, will be speaking about protecting human rights in the Americas. This is an institution, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, of central importance in the hemisphere, and it does really interesting and really important work. And to have a member of that commission to speak to us directly is actually quite interesting. So that's this coming Thursday, October 21st at noon. That'll run from noon to 1:15 p.m. The other upcoming event I want to call your attention to is our next Center for the Americas event, in which we will have two leading literary figures from Latin America, Carlos Lave, a Chilean writer, and Carlos Pintado, who is a Cuban-American writer. They are going to be involved in events taking place in connection with the Neustadt Award and World Literature Today, and have generously offered to share their time to talk about literature and politics in Latin America. And that event is 2 weeks basically from now. That's on Wednesday, October 27th, and that will be an hour long from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. So things to keep in mind. But I'm very pleased. We're really pleased to have Dr. Stephen Gullberg with us today to talk about the astronomy of the ancient Inca Empire. Who he's recently published a book on this topic with Springer. His background is that he has a doctorate in astronomy from James Cook University in Australia. He's an associate professor here at the University of Oklahoma, and a lead faculty of the School of Integrative and Cultural Studies here. He also works with he's the chair of the International Astronomical Union's working group on astronomy and culture, which comprises both ancient and contemporary cultural issues linked to astronomy. And this book and the work that he does is based on extensive field research on the astronomy of the Incas in the Peruvian Andes. He's published many research papers on this topic. And he regularly is invited to present at conferences around the world on this topic because people find this so interesting. And he has such an interesting take on it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gullberg, who will now guide us through learning about the astronomy of the Inca Empire.
And just let me share my screen here. I'd just like to start by thanking Charlie and the Center for the Americas for inviting me to talk today. Obviously, I enjoy speaking about Inca astronomy a lot, so any chance that I get, I never hesitate. And today I'll talk about the astronomy of the Inca Empire, the use and significance of the sun and the night sky, both Inca astronomy and the book that I had published by Springer last year of that title. And as was just mentioned, I'm the director for archaeoastronomy here at the university and also the chair for archaeoastronomy for the International Astronomical Union. And there's the cover of the book, Astronomy of the Inca Empire, Use and Significance of the Sun and the Night Sky. It was published by Springer just over a year ago in August. So my plan for the afternoon here is just to give a brief look at what is archaeoastronomy and some background on Inca astronomy, and then I'll talk about what the Incas saw in the Milky Way, and then I'll get more into my field research with photos and such of the light and shadow effects around this part of the Inca Empire, and then just in the end briefly touch on education for astronomy and culture. I'll begin the International Astronomical Union, which is the world governing body for astronomy, has taken a definite interest in archaeoastronomy and cultural astronomy by creating the working group that I chair. And the working group actively explores all aspects of astronomy and culture and promotes educational public outreach and help educators learn to use cultural astronomy to inspire students to pursue science. We're a large working group, nearly 100 members now from over 35 countries, and we're becoming even larger because the IAU has now talked to me about changing the working group into a full commission for cultural astronomy. But what is archaeoastronomy? Archaeoastronomy basically is studying how ancient cultures used astronomy in their daily lives, looking at the astronomical significance of sites and structures of the prehistoric peoples. It's interdisciplinary because it's not just astronomy, it's also elements of archaeology and certainly anthropology. You have to place everything that you find astronomically into cultural context. And alongside of archaeoastronomy and cultural astronomy is ethnoastronomy. Ethnoastronomy deals with astronomical systems of indigenous peoples. And more often than not, this means living indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of interviewing and learning done from different indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, learning about their astronomy. Now, before I get into what the Incas were, largely interested in, I'll talk a little bit about the horizon positions of the sun. The Incas and many other cultures use this as well. You may or may not have noticed that in the summer, the sun's path, and this is a southern hemisphere diagram actually, the sun's path crosses the sky higher in the summer and lower in the winter, and then in the middle at the equinox, which gives it correspondingly different positions on the horizon where the sun rises and sets. Well, these cultures, the Incas being one of them, knew that because the sun is going to rise and set on that day in the same place every year. So they could, like learning how to use that as a calendar to guide them in their daily lives. And why is this? Well, the Earth's axis, you probably heard, is tilted to about 23.5 degrees, basically 23.439. But this tilt always goes, it's always oriented in the same direction as the Earth orbits the sun, which means that at different times of the year, the sun's rays strike directly on a different part of the Earth. So here at the December solstice, which is in the southern hemisphere of the summer, the sun is directly hitting the Tropic of Capricorn. And the June solstice, it's directly hitting the Tropic of Cancer. And in between, this is what gives the different rising and setting positions for the sun. So let's talk more specifically about the astronomy of the Incas. Astronomy was an integral part of Andean mythology, and creation was at the very heart of the Incas' religion and agriculture. They proclaimed themselves to be the children of the sun. They worshiped the sun and viewed their emperor as being the sun's direct descendant. They built their civilization upon cultures that had preceded them, such as the Wari, the Nazca, and the Chavin. Their period of dominance, lasting little more than a century, was far too short for them to independently develop advanced forms of religion, social structure, construction, and astronomy. But they were very good at assimilating knowledge, both what was available at the time of their empire's inception, as well as that of the many tribes that they conquered during their reign. The Emperor Pachacuti and his son and grandson successfully built the largest empire ever known in the Americas, 4,800 kilometers from Chile to Colombia. And they established armies and fortresses at distant stations with the infrastructure of roads and storehouses that was necessary to support them. They made solar worship the official religion of the empire, and Pachacuti imposed it across the realm. He's maintaining that he was the son of the sun, and his wife was the daughter of the moon. And thus the Incas venerated the sun, the Inca, and his predecessors. The Incas learned the cycles of the solstice and equinoxes, as we looked at a couple of slides ago, and as a key component of their annual crop management activities, as well as for determining dates for religious celebrations. Rituals mark times for planting and harvesting, as well as major celebrations of the sun. Examples of prominent festivals were those of Inti Raymi at the June solstice, Capac Raymi at the December solstice, Qespiwanka at the March equinox, and Koya Raymi at the September equinox. Inti Raymi was Inca's solar festival at the time of the June solstice, and it's still celebrated in Cusco today. Some of you may have been there for this. It is quite an occasion. It was a festival for the masses that brought many pilgrims to Cusco. It was an elaborate ritual, took place over many days, and thanks were given to the sun and prayers said for the crops. Capac Raymi was another festival of the sun, in this case at the time of the December solstice. And remember, in the southern hemisphere, the December solstice is the summer, beginning of the summer. This was a celebration of crop germination and the start of a new season, as well as ceremonies of the passage to manhood for young Inca noblemen. Since the sun was the primary deity of the Incas, it is reasonable that many Waka's shrines were associated with solar worship. In the early 16th century, it was said that there were over 400 Wakas in the Cusco Valley, but most of them were destroyed by the Spaniards. Those that remained primarily were the Wakas that had been designed in rock. Celestial orientations were integrated into temples and Wakas, as well as other constructs such as solar pillars built more specifically for astronomical purposes. Beyond Cusco, two solar pillars overlooking the modern village of Urubamba escaped the Spanish purge, and field research is verified when viewed from a large granite boulder in the center of Huayna palace, Qespiwanka, that they mark the position of the rising sun at June solstice. And here I'll point out that when we talk about zenith, it's what's directly overhead, and nadir or anti-zenith is directly beneath. While zenith passage took place overhead and not on the horizon, in their system of horizon astronomy, the Incas were still using this for calendrical markers at the time of the zenith passage, noting the position of sunrise, and the zenith passage occurs at the latitude of Cusco on February 13th and October 30th. The horizon position could then be used to determine the date of nadir, or the anti-zenith sun. Vertical towers such as the Sun Terrasi in Cusco were used to facilitate the observation of the sun or moon at zenith. Anti-zenith passage occurs in Cusco on August 18th and April 26th, and coincides with the planting and harvest of maize, times of Inca ceremony and celebration. So again, they were using all of this to mark specific days for crop management. Maize-related agriculture festivals could possibly be associated with anti-zenith observances. The Incas had a very interesting view of the Milky Way. When the Spaniards first conquered Inca Empire, they attempted to define Andean astronomy in European terms familiar to them. They failed to fully realize the Incas viewed the cosmos from a different perspective. While European astronomy followed a zodiac that centered around the ecliptic, the Incas oriented their sky with the Milky Way. The Milky Way at times will be viewed as rising in the southeast, passing through the zenith and setting in the northwest. And 12 hours later, the horizon positions have shifted, and the band of stars rises instead from the northeast, traveling again through the zenith, but now setting in the southwest. Now, all this is for those of us that live in light polluted areas, gets kind of lost upon us because you don't really see this. If you're in a very dark area, you could watch this happen. This 24-hour rotation cycle creates two zenith intersecting intercardinal axes that divide the celestial sphere into 4 observable quarters. And here's a diagram showing basically that these are 12 hours apart, and only at the time of the June solstice will the sun rise into the Milky Way, and the December solstice will it rise into the Milky Way. But they divided their sky in their image of their empire into these 4 quarters. At the time of this December solstice, when the sun rises at 114 degrees on the horizon, the evening positioning of the band of the Milky Way lies similar to the southeast. During the June solstice sunrise at 064 degrees, the Milky Way is situated in like fashion in the northeast. Times of the solstices are the only ones when the sun rises and travels with the Milky Way. Inca cosmology recognizes that both the celestial river and the sun rise together at the dry seasons beginning in June, and the rainy seasons start in December, and sometimes use this correlation to explain the seasonal intensity of the sun, which feeds upon the powerful waters. The Inca ordered their sky by this celestial quadripartition in contrast with the use of the general direction of ecliptic travel that was used in the West. This gave the Incas a nearly 90-degree difference in their perspective of the heavens and the cosmological constructs that were developed accordingly. Inca cosmology viewed the Milky Way as a river flowing across the night sky in a very literal sense. They saw earthly waters being drawn into the heavens and then later returned to Earth after a celestial rejuvenation. The Earth was thought to float in a cosmic ocean, and when the celestial river's orientation was such that it dipped into that ocean, the waters were drawn into the sky. The Milky Way is therefore an integral part of the continuing recycling of water throughout the Qespiwanka universe. The Vilcanota River flows southeast to northwest through the Sacred Valley, past Machu Picchu and beyond. Its waters are thought to rise into the Milky Way, and once having traveled its celestial course, fall again to the earth as rain. The Milky Way is said to be a heavenly reflection of the Vilcanota. Now, one of the most fascinating parts to me about the Incas and the Milky Way are the dark constellations that they saw. We think of constellations as connecting stars in our Western astronomy. The Incas saw dark constellations in the dark patches of the Milky Way that were formed by interstellar dust and gas that were blocking the light of the millions of stars beyond them. And so they saw great cosmological characters meant to guide them in their daily lives. And I was first exposed to this in my research. We were camped out at the top of the Ollantaytambo Ridge, waiting for the June solstice sunrise the next day. And my research assistant, Carlos Aranabar, took my green laser pointer and gave me just a magnificent tour of these dark constellations that I'm about to show you. Here's a diagram. Gary Urton was one of the early first researchers of this, and this is a diagram of his, but the dark constellations stretch across nearly 150 degrees of the Milky Way's expanse. Most of them are animals figuring prominently in Andean cosmology. The Spanish chronicler Polo de Anagardo found that the Incas to believe that the animal constellations were responsible for procreation and augmentation of their animal counterparts on the Earth. So here are the creatures in the pantheon of the Inca Milky Way. And there's a drawing of them there, but I'll move on to my wife, Jessica, painted this section of the Milky Way for me so I could sketch them in. The lead creature is Machquai the serpent, followed by Hanpatu the toad, Yutu Tinamu, which is a bird, and then Yakana, the mother Yama, and Unya Yamaka, the baby Yama, suckling its mother, followed by Atok the fox, and then Mishiruna, the shepherd, who is kind of herding the whole flock of them. And dark constellations were also seen by several other southern cultures. Here's some examples. There's the mother and baby Yamas again. In Australia, the Aboriginal Australians in the same, so you can see it's the same section of the Milky Way in all three images here. the Aboriginal historians saw another bird, an emu, stretched across that section, and in Argentina, the maniac, the McCoy saw, was stretched across the same section of the Milky Way. So it was not just isolated to the Incas. So I'll show you once again the Inca constellations of the serpent, the toad, the bird, the mother llama, the baby llama, the fox, and the shepherd, because here's a photograph of the Milky Way. So here is the serpent, here is the toad, here is the bird, the mother llama, the baby llama, and the shepherd. Can you see them? I like to mention my wife, Jessica's art again. She, in my book that we're talking about today, did 31 paintings, drawings, and maps for me. These aren't two of them. These are other ones, but I point these out because they're great examples. These are not photographs. These are watercolors that she did for me of the Spiral Galaxy and Hydra and the Tripod Nebula. It's great to have your own live-in artist when you're trying to illustrate a book or a paper. So my field research was based on 6 research trips where I examined 31 sites altogether, the largest number of them in the Cusco region, and then more in the Sacred Valley, then more surrounding Machu Picchu. And there's just the names of the sites in the Cusco region that I examined that are all outlined in the book. One of my favorite sites is Kenko Grande, which is just north of Cusco up the hill. It's a very large limestone outcropping. I mean, many people can stand on top of it here at the same time. And in a small part of it, they carved these 2 sukankas or gnomons. And off just to the lower left here, off the picture, is a rock with a crevice that at the morning of the June solstice sunrise allows sunlight to come through the crevice and illuminate first one and the other of the gnomons, then cast shadows to form the face of a puma, the awakening of the puma, one of those 3 sacred creatures in Inca cosmology, the condor for the world above, the puma for the here and now, and the serpent for the world below. There's the crevice that allows the light to come through and illuminate the gnomons. Kenko Grande on top of it also had carved a channel for fluids, a divinatory channel that they use to foretell certain events. Inside Kenko Grande is a very nicely carved altar in a cave, and on the far side of the altar is a stairway that toward local noon in around and near the June solstice, the sunlight climbs the stairs. And you can see here it's just getting started. And then as the sun continues to rise, it starts climbing the stairs, then fully covers all 3 stairs and points toward the altar for whatever ceremonial purposes that they had designed it for. And there's a rear entrance to the cave also that at the time of the equinox sunrise casts a shadow on the rear altar, or not shadow, casts sunlight on the rear altar here. Not too far from, much further up beyond Kenko Grande is another site I really like a lot, Laco. Here's part of Laco here. It's another limestone outcropping that in the far distance, that's Nevada Osangate. But among many other things carved into Laco, there are 3 caves. The southwest cave, the northeast cave, and the southeast cave. And here this photo is taken, I'm standing inside the southwest cave. This light tube was positioned by the Incas to point down at an altar. I'm standing inside looking out and just happened to be able to capture the crescent moon crossing the path that light tube is aimed for, showing that the moon does indeed align with it, and the sun would as well. Now the northeast cave, I mentioned that the sun will rise in different positions each day in between the 2 solstices. So here the sun is moving from right to left, getting closer and closer, and then here it stops at the June solstice, which is also means a standstill. So it's the sun stops there. It's directly aligned with the cave opening. and shines in and illuminates this altar, and then the reflection illuminates more of the cave for the ceremonial purposes they use there. Then after the couple of days that it's there, it starts moving back to the right and heads on toward the December solstice. The light illuminated at least part of the altar for 2 hours and 8 minutes, and here it's receding. It's almost done. The southeast cave is the most ornate of the three. There's the entrance to it. It's a multi-chamber cave. Stepping down into it, and there's the serpent, the sacred creature carved on the wall for the entrance. This also had a light tube. They called it the Temple of the Moon, so there certainly must have been moon ceremonies, but I also found the light tube was oriented for the time of the zenith sun. And it would shine down at the zenith sun. And this was at when the zenith sun crossed on the 26th of October, down on the altar that was carved within the cave. And you can see that bigger picture of the altar there, and the sun illuminating it. And again, for the ceremonial purposes that they had designed the cave to permit. Now, not too far from both Kenko Grande and Laco is what one of my colleagues in Peru calls Waka 44. It's a small limestone outcropping, often overlooked, which has two carved circles with alignments for the horizon, solar horizon events. There's the two circles, the little one and the big one. There's some seats they're kind of eroded that are carved here. But what the Incas did was they created a gauge to show them where to look for the horizon events. You draw a tangential line between the two circles. It'll show you where to look for the June solstice sunrise and the December solstice sunset. In the other direction for the December solstice sunrise and the June solstice sunset. Then across the two for the equinox sunrise and sunset. And here's an example. Here's the big circle and the little one. There's the line between them. And that's pointing right there for the June solstice sunrise. And like I said, there were carved chairs they could sit in to watch for these events. Not exactly at Cusco. This is further to the southeast is Tipon. Very nicely designed site there with terraces and fountains. But there is also elite and non-elite viewing areas for the June solstice sunset. There's an Intiwatana there, and I'll talk about a handful of other sites that have the name of Intiwatana, which is roughly translated as hitching post to the sun. And it's thought by some that these are used in a ceremony to keep the sun in the winter as it got lower and lower in the sky from continuing to descend below the horizon and disappearing forever. Here in Tipon, you could look across the Intiwatana at the June solstice sunset is what this is oriented for. And from the Intiwatana, this is looking back down at some of the structures down below. And this plain over here is where the non-elites could have been viewing the event. While the elites going through a double jam doorway would be further up, closer to the Intiwatana. And then off to the west a ways of Cusco is Hawite. And it's the axis between the horizon points of the June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset dominate the upper sector of the complex. And the principal stone lies with the adjacent structure on that axis. And the principal stone here, you can see there's a lot of carvings in there. It's very, very fine, very ornate. There's a lot of cultural history that was carved into the principal stone at Sewite. Principal stone's back here toward the southwest corner. On the southeast corner is where the niches I'm about to show you, and then the site continues down the stairway and fountains and on to some other objects in the grounds. But there's a niche and corridor here aligned for the June solstice sunrise. And here's looking outward toward the rising sun on June solstice. There's some low clouds partially obscuring it. But when the sun does come up, it comes back and, of course, it illuminates the corridor and the niche. Now, as you continue down, There's the fountain with the steps alongside it, and this is looking off at where I'll give you a closer view of the Rumiwasi stone, the Ushnu, or platform for ceremonies, and also a stone called the third stone. That's the Rumiwasi. You can see it has broken over the years. And on the side of here is some more divination channels to pour fluid down and see, I guess, which way they go to help decide make a decision, a divination of some sort. The Chingana is a Ushnu, a big ceremonial platform. And then the third stone has some interesting aspects, orientations to it as well that are described in the book. Moving on to the Sacred Valley, and these are the sites that I looked at in the Sacred Valley. And talking about these doorways, double jam doorways are for elites, and here, this is at Qespiwanka. This is a triple jam doorway, so it must have been very elite people that could be the only ones passing through there. But we'll start at Pisac, which is well north of Cusco across the Sacred Valley. It has an Intiwatana there too, hitching places of the sun. They're found at Machu Picchu, the Urubamba River, Tipon, and also here at Pisac. Here at Pisac, the Intiwatana is largely a partially carved rock in a temple group that's enclosed by a semicircular masonry wall forming the shape of a letter D in general. And this is the central part of it here. There you can see the gnomon on the upper flat surface. The gnomon aligns with a nearby peak in the 064 direction of the June solstice sunrise. Here you can see the D-shaped wall around it. Well, I'll put it back, the D-shaped wall around the stone of the Intiwatana. And immediately to the east of the Intiwatana is another enclosed rock, which appears to be an observing platform or an Ushnu. It opens on the southeastern horizon toward the 114 direction of the December solstice sunrise. And the Intiwatana could be considered temple of the sun. To its west, this is called the temple of the moon. It could be illuminated by moonlight, but there were no obvious orientations of any sort. Moving on to Qespiwanka. Qespiwanka is the palace built by Pachacuti's son, Wanakapak. It's near the modern village of Urubamba. And while it was recorded by the Spanish chroniclers that there were once 16 towers on the horizon on the horizons of Cusco, they were all extirpated by the Spanish priests, the Catholic priests. The two that survive are on the Cerro Sewa Ridge above Urubamba, and they mark the rising sun at the June solstice when viewed from the palace of Wanakapak. And this at least validates that what the chronicles recorded of the Cusco pillars being used for solar observations. In the center of the palace court grounds is this white granite boulder. That's a modern chapel there. But from the granite boulder, and boulders are considered to be sacred with energized life force within them. From the boulder, there are orientations for the June solstice sunset, the June solstice sunrise, and the December solstice sunrise. It's a slightly magnified view from the boulder of the Qespiwanka pillars on the ridge above. But in this photo here, unmagnified, there's not at June solstice yet, but approaching it. The sun is now rising with the right-hand pillar, and it'll continue to move toward the left-hand pillar as the solstice approaches. And now here in the lower photo is there's the top of the boulder looking at the December solstice sunrise, and it's rising over Cerro Unaraki, and there's the Cerro Sewa, or the Cerro Pumawachana Ridge rather, in between. And on top of Cerro Unaraki, there are three pillars that are located there. There's Cerro Unaraki, and it's 4,377 meters to 14,360 feet above sea level, and the pillars are north and south. And I'll just try to mention quickly that when we were at Qespiwanka, I saw through the binoculars there was something on top, so we decided on short notice to go, and And we got a taxi driver to take us there. He said, "Oh yeah, I can take you up about 2/3 of the way up the mountain, and then you can continue to climb from there." Well, it was maybe about 1/4 of the way up the mountain, and where the road stopped, and then the villagers there that we were talking with said, "Oh yeah, we can." It takes take a couple hours to climb up there. Well, of course, they lived at that altitude. I lived near sea level, so it took me all the rest of the day, especially with no trails, to climb up to the top of Sarayuna Rocky. And we weren't prepared for the darkness and spending the night, but we got there as the sun was setting. And this was in June, so it was winter, and it was going to get down toward freezing. And we decided we had to come down at night in the dark, but fortunately there was a quarter moon that cast some light. And again, there were no trails in the upper part of the mountain. And then the village that we left from, at 9 o'clock, somebody pulled a master switch and there was no electricity in the village anymore. So there was no lights, so we couldn't even see where it was going to be. I had left a taxi driver to wait for us, told him that I'd pay him when we got back, and I wondered if he was still going to be there. We finally found our way down, and lo and behold, he was there waiting. He wanted his money. So we had our ride back off of the mountain, but it was a bit more of an adventure than I had originally planned. Chinchero is an interesting site. This is more in the heart of the Sacred Valley. Its walls and terraces are oriented exactly north, south, and east and west. And they had no GPS, they had no compasses. So it's speculative a little bit how they could have determined this, but it could very well have been done by shadow casting from a gnomon to find the direction of south. And then with that, geometrically, you can extrapolate northeast and west and establish the directions that way. But besides the cardinal directions, the axis of the June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset appears again between the two major Wakas. Titicaca is the one that we're on here, and very far in the distance is another large one called Chingana that I'll show you in a couple of slides. There's the central stairway to get up to Titicaca where we just were. One of the other Wakas at Chinchero, this one was at 3786 meters or 12,421 feet above sea level. That's my primary research assistant, Carlos Aranabar, there with me. But Chingana is the other in the distance major Waka that I talked about. For perspective, there's one of my colleagues that's standing right there walking towards it. So you can see it's rather large. And then the one that we were on is Titicaca, very large again. And looking from Chingana to Titicaca in the direction of the December solstice sunset is what's depicted here. There's the cardinal walls again, east, west, and north and south. And there was also a zigzag divinatory channel there, but this one I'm skeptical as if that was its original location. It looked to me like it could have been moved in place there for tourist reasons. In the same general part of the Sacred Valley is Maras, or the salt ponds, a very, very famous place for tourists to visit. There's a salt stream that comes down out of the mountain, and the villagers, the families own different salt ponds here where they mine the salt and sell it. But I found no supportable astronomy there. It's just a very interesting site. But also nearby is Moray, and this part of the state of Chinchero, which is Topa Inca's actually Pachacuti's grandson. He fashioned 3 natural sinkholes into a remarkable set of terrace basins. You can see the basins here at Moray. And it's possible a public ceremony could have occurred on the days of the zenith sun, where the terraces would cast no shadows with the sun coming straight down at local noon. But a more visible site is at the June solstice, where these terraces were constructed, 9 linear terraces, because as the sun rises, the shadow recedes and illuminates the terraces on the day of the June solstice. Moving further to the west, Chopikaka or Ñuapa Iglesia a nicely carved Waka here, and then this wall with niches for sacred objects. The cave itself opens to the December solstice sunrise. And the black granite Waka here faces inward, and its carvings are similar to the Bagno di Nusta at the Ollantaytambo, so it's thought that the same artist might have done them both. And so moving a little further on west to Ollantaytambo, which by the way is the last stop that you can drive to get to Machu Picchu. From there, you either take the train for either between an hour and a half, 2 hours, or you hike the Inca Trail for 4 days, which is a very popular thing to do. And you actually have to get reservations to be able to do it. Pachacuti conquered and raised the original settlement at Ollantaytambo, built his own personal estate, including a ceremonial center with massive stonework, carvings, and a water shrine, water channels, and fountains. The most striking feature when you first approach is the magnificent set of 17 stone terraces ascending the hillside. The terraces of Pumatillas face out to the rise of the December solstice sun, and in the opposite direction face in toward and frame nicely the June solstice sunset. What's sometimes known as the Ollantaytambo's Temple of the Sun was extensively damaged by the Spanish in their purge, but this foundation and a wall of 6 monoliths still exists. The wall faces the Pisac mountain, but it's not precisely oriented with the rise of the June solstice sun. The Pisac mountain lies opposite Ollantaytambo to the northeast and does align with June solstice if viewed from what is some call the pyramid of Pakaratampu, and there's the pyramid of Pakaratampu, and the sun coming past the mountain into this area, which is what's called the pyramid, and then the December solstice sun coming in this direction. So there's Pisac again. It exhibits on its side 2 structures and a face. And here's a little bit more of a close-up of the structures. And the face is Tunapa, the messenger of the god Viracocha, who is the original creation god for the Inca Empire. While the Temple of the Sun was a primary site for ceremony in the upper sector, Hanan sector, the Inca Masana, and the lower Huron sector also has a nice light and shadow effect. There's horizontal gnomons on the side of this wall. They're designed to cast shadows at December solstice local noon into these notches down below. And so here you can see the shadows coming from the gnomons and coming down and filling this notch for sure. This one here is kind of broken off and eroded, but it was probably the same way. And a good friend, colleague of mine, Georg Zadi, who is one of the principal developers of the astronomical software Stellarium, which is free open access. He just at a recent conference developed a simulation of this, showing the sun and the shadows turning and the shadows coming down and filling this. It was very nicely done and very good. I hope he does more of these because they're great examples for archaeoastronomy. So now we move into Machu Picchu itself. And like I said, you have to get there either by walk or by train. I never had the extra days to walk in and out, so I took the train. Peru Rail is the primary source. Comes into Aguas Calientes. And some of you, I'm sure, have already tried cuy, which is guinea pig. It's a traditional meal. It goes back to the time of the Incas. I think that the way they present it, they plated it here, is done up for the tourists. But it certainly is still a staple today. When I was visiting families in the rural areas, in their houses, and in this one house, there was a stone pen in the back of the main room where the guinea pigs were raised. And when it was guinea pig night, they plucked them out and fixed them for dinner. And then, of course, chicha, maize corn beer, is a very sacred type beverage that goes back to the time of the Incas. They used it certainly to drink, but also for sacred ceremonies in those divinatory channels and such. It's thought that they poured it there as well. So the Machu Picchu region here's Machu Picchu itself. And the gorge below is the river Intiwatana, and then on the opposite ridge is the Yaktapata Sun Temple, and it turns out that the three of these lie all on the same axis, the June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset. And Aguas Calientes is down here to the left, and you have to take tour buses to get up these switchbacks to get up to Machu Picchu. But if you're walking on the Inca Trail, it'll come down this way and through the Sun Gate down into Machu Picchu. Then it continues on. The Inca Trail does around the backside of Machu Picchu as well. There's the drawbridge that is on the backside. They could lift these planks off of this area here to keep someone from slipping in the back way unexpectedly. But then the scarier part of that is the Inca Trail continued along this line, along this cliff face. And fortunately, they've got it all sealed off, so nobody can get out there anymore, because that looks far too dangerous for me. This is a classic image of Machu Picchu, and I put it here because I want to show you this is where the Sacred Plaza is located. And here's the Sacred Plaza again. Like I said, it's on the axis of the June solstice sunrise, the December solstice sunset. There's the June solstice sun rising above it. Also in Machu Picchu, there's a site called the Mortars. It's in the eastern urban sector, and these mortars were carved when they've got water in them most of the time, so that a reflection can be cast off the water at the time of the equinox. The two mortars are aligned approximately north and south with respect to one another, and there's the window reflection in the one mortar. Intimachay was said to be constructed as their sunrise at the time of the December solstice, and Qespiwanka, the tunnel-like horizontal light tube, was oriented to emit sunlight to the cave for about 10 days before and after the solstice. And this again was at the time of a festival celebrated by the nobility, including ceremonies of passage to manhood for young Inca noblemen. Temple of the Condor is interesting. Here's the basically the beak of the condor, and the rock here were the wings. There's a cave down here beyond it. And this was designed to represent or be have an effect at the time of the anti-zenith sun. Here's looking from the cave back out, and Tom Zaidema, a very preeminent anthropologists, argued the Inca were interested in the timing of the region's anti-zenith passage of the sun, which occurred, like I said, on April 26th and August 18th, the days that the sun is at nadir for the latitude of Cusco. And the cave is oriented to the anti-zenith sunrise with a true azimuth of 074. And here is a depiction of a drawing of that sunbeam coming in across the beak and the wings and into the cave on the morning of the anti-zenith sunrise. The Torreon is one of the most famous features in Machu Picchu. Carefully fitted rock wall that includes a window open to the horizon position of the June solstice sunrise. That's the June solstice sun coming in through the window, illuminating this rock. And it also is oriented for the heliacal rise of the Pleiades. There's looking down below up at the window, and Hiram Bingham, even further down below, is the Royal Mausoleum. It's what Hiram Bingham named that when he first examined Machu Picchu starting back in 1911. The mountain that's so prominent in the pictures you see is Huayna Picchu. And here's a telephoto enlargement showing that the Incas did build some structures there, as well as their stairs to climb the peak. And there I am looking down at Machu Picchu down below. But there's a trail down the backside of Huayna Picchu as well. It leads down to the Grand Caverna. The Grand Caverna includes the Temple of the Moon. It's located far below the peak. It's about halfway down to the river on the backside on the northwest face. And when you get down there are two caves. The upper cave has 5 double jam niches, and these are kind of rather large ones, so it's speculated they could have been filled with mummies at different times. And then the lower cave, its door and windows are open to the June solstice sunset, and there's the June solstice sunset light coming into the lower Huron cave. So back to the Machu Picchu region here. Here's Machu Picchu, the river Intiwatana, and the Sun Temple of Yactopata, all on that axis. Here is the Intiwatana of Machu Picchu, which the sacred plaza just off to its left, but this has got a good view of the Yactopata Ridge. And in 2003, it was discovered over 100 structures here that were totally engulfed by the cloud forest, the mountain jungle that you need machetes to cut through. They do keep the Sun Temple clear now. Here's the Sun Temple of Yactopata. And I bring you back to this picture here because I take note of this stone channel that's beginning by our feet at the main door for the Sun Temple. Because here you can see this channel is oriented for the sacred plaza of Machu Picchu on that same axis of December solstice sunrise, or June solstice sunrise rather, December solstice sunset. And there's the June solstice sun rising off in the distance. It's thought that they could have poured ceremonial fluids here, again, because fluids energized many different things, including the sun, to keep it from continuing its winter descent down below the horizon. Here it's June solstice sunrise again. Down in the gorge below, there's the river Intiwatana, very nicely carved rock with cultural features. It's carved granite between Machu Picchu and Yactopata, and there's steps, platforms, basins, a cave. Hiram Bingham first noted it in 1911, but it wasn't fully understood back then. Here I diagrammed some of the different things we found at the site. So once again, there's this axis for the June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset, and it wasn't until Yactopata was just scientifically rediscovered, that it became obvious this was all a very much larger ceremonial complex. And there could also be another orientation with the Overlook Temple of Yactopata across the river Intiwatana again to Mount Machu Picchu. Just to sum up the findings in my research, these are the different sites in the Cusco region and the different solar horizon events: June solstice sunrise, sunset, December solstice sunrise, sunset, zenith, anti-zenith. And here's the ones for the Sacred Valley sites and the Machu Picchu sites. And to summarize all of them, found that for the astronomical rock sites, 63% of them had orientations for June solstice sunrise, and December solstice sunrise 56%, and the June solstice sunset 38%, 25% for December solstice sunset, and so forth. So the findings show the Inca landscape really was filled with examples of astronomy used in their culture. Light and shadow effects throughout the year, especially at the times of the solstices and the equinoxes and some of the other events. Regarding the 8 primary solar horizon events, like I mentioned, those at the solstices were most prominent, with June being first and December close second. And that's when the Inca's 2 big annual festivals occurred. So the data all supports the writings in the chronicles about solstices being of primary importance in the sun worshiping society. I'll just mention quickly that in the College of Professional and Tuning Studies, we started a program of study for archaeoastronomy and astronomy and culture. It's science-oriented, but we set it up primarily with online coursework so that we could have worldwide enrollments. We have some virtual reality, video conferencing. Here are our graduate courses that we're offering on archaeoastronomy methods: archaeoastronomy of Chaco Canyon, Cahokia, Latin American archaeoastronomy, archaeoastronomy beyond the Americas, ethnoastronomy, the astronomy traditions of the First Nations, the United States and Canada. And the one course that is on site is a 1-week special field research course, a very intense. It's a 3-hour course all done in 1 week, field research in archaeoastronomy, which we will be conducting at the time of the June solstice at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. It's an on-site elective course, so if we have students that can't make it, they don't have to, but it's something that they most of them really want to do. We're working on starting our first undergraduate cultural astronomy course in the fall of 2022, so that is yet to come. So anyway, just back to, this was basically all talking about things that are in my book, Astronomy of the Inca Empire, Using Significance of the Sun and the Night Sky, published by Springer last August a year ago. And there's just some of the pictures to show you the artwork and research photos that are illustrating throughout the book. My wife's artwork and my research photos. And it's a very readable book for anyone who would like to take a closer look at it. And that's one of my favorites. My wife's painting a watercolor of the night sky in Machu Picchu, because there's a bit of the Milky Way there, but all the constellations here are perfectly accurate, the constellations in the sky. Now, if you are interested in the book, you don't have to go out and buy it unless you really want to, because the OU University Libraries paid Springer for digital access of this for all of you who are OU faculty or students. Just go to the library's databases and e-reference materials site, find the EBSCO host collections, and either search my last name or search the title of the book, and it'll come right up for you, and you can download a digital copy of it, and including everything I wrote and all the images and such. And I think you'll really enjoy taking a look at it. After our question and answer period here, if you have any other questions, there's my email address. I'll be glad to talk with you anytime. And this here is the URL for the archaeoastronomy programs web pages. But with that, I'd just like to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to tell you about Inca astronomy today and listen to what I have to say. And thanks again for the invitation to talk. And I'll be available for any questions someone might have.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Gullberg. That was most interesting, most exciting to see all of those places. If you do go to the university library system, actually, if you just type Dr. Gullberg's last name into Discover, the book comes up right away. So
good. It's even easier. Glad to hear that.
To find it. It will take you to EBSCO, but it comes up just with your last name very quickly.
There's one more thing I wanted to mention about this photo here. Yeah. My research assistant, Carlos, who I mentioned, that's his sister and her husband and their kids. This is their family restaurant in rural Peru that we're sharing a meal with them there that day. And also, as you can see, some Cusquena Negras and some chicha. But
very good. Well, we do want to move now to questions, and we have one question to start with, which I'll mention just in a minute. But for everyone who has not posed a question yet, the way to do so is to go to the bottom of your screen, and there is a little icon there that says Q&A. So if you go there and click on that, you can ask additional questions. But let me begin with a question that comes from Michael Gibble. And he's interested in knowing what happened to the sun and moon worship with the advent of Spanish colonialists. Did it remain in architecture and art?
That's a good question. A good question to ask. Once the Spaniards had finished their conquest, basically, and it didn't happen overnight. I think they finally gained full control by about 1572 after starting in 1532. Anyway, subsequent to that, the Catholic priests wanted to totally eradicate any trace of the indigenous religion. So they set about a campaign of extirpation, destroying all the solar pillars around Cusco, destroying every Waka they could find that was destroyable. Not the ones that were carved in stone, but many of them that were made out of other materials. So and basically the outward continuation of these religious practices were prohibited. They wanted to convert everybody to Catholicism. So it was not widely practiced, but it was not forgotten, because the oral traditions have been passed on from one generation to the next, so that Quechua and residents of Peru today, the citizens of Peru, still know of these traditions. But the country, of course, is very Catholic now. So the ideas didn't die, but the practice of them really kind of went by the wayside.
Very good, thank you. And just to add a point on that, there was this effort to extirpate all idol worship as it was conceived of by the missionaries, you suggested. But as you also suggest, there was a great deal of syncretism that resulted, and there's a lot of indigenous cosmology embedded in nominally colonial and post-colonial attire and images and such. So it's a very interesting process to try to rediscover, as you suggest, how they did not forget, despite the fact that they were not allowed to practice these things. These things have continued. Another question comes from B.L. Phillips. He is interested in Coricancha in Cusco, and he wondered what kind of archaeoastronomical function it might have had.
It was, of course, the sun temple of the Incas, and there has been said to be a couple of certain alignments for the sun down quarters at different times, but they're in dispute. There's been some more recent research by some friends, colleagues of mine that have done some very careful, exhaustive research with modern techniques that they say that they don't find much correspondence there at all to those alignments. But regardless, it was their sun temple, and unfortunately, of course, after the conquest, the thatch roofs and all of the upper parts were taken away. When the Catholics built the cathedral on top of the Coricancha. But if you get a chance to visit Cusco, it's a very wonderful place to visit and tour. And of course, they have good exhibits set up that give a lot of the cultural history there. And inside the Coricancha, in the museum type setting, they talk about the Inca's dark constellations. They have a painting of it, and other things like that. So astronomy is not lost upon the place there. It's just being argued as to how much of actual orientations there were there or not. I would tend to think, without having done up until my colleagues just did this recent research, I was tending to think that it was there because they designed astronomical orientations into so many other things. So I still have to go back and take another look with this new paper myself and see what I think of the research that's been done, because I'm not convinced either way yet, although I highly respect my friends who did this research.
Could you say something about the development of this field of knowledge? Certainly, astronomy is ancient, and some knowledge of ancient structures related to astronomy is ancient. But it also seems like a lot of this has been discovered relatively recently. When you wrote your dissertation, what was known about the things you've just been describing to us, and what has been discovered since then? How has this field of understanding evolved?
And I'll go back even a little further than just Inca astronomy. Archaeoastronomy as a field is a baby compared to other sciences. It's an infant. Astronomy itself, they say, is the oldest science, but the other sciences are far older as well. There was a smattering of books here and there that were written in the early 20th century, late 19th century, but not much. So archaeoastronomy didn't start really emerging until in papers and books until a little bit in the 60s and more in the 70s and the 80s. It was in 1971 that was the first time that the actual term archaeoastronomy appeared in print, and it was early in the year. And then in the 70s and 80s, some authors like Tony Avini and Ed Krupp started writing books about cultural astronomy of the Incas, of the Mayas, at Stonehenge, and things like that, that were still of the more scientific aspect, not the more popular, less scientific books that came out at times. But unfortunately, as the field was developing, there were these other works that came out that didn't really have a lot of scientific astronomical support to what they were saying. So that helped keep the field from advancing in credibility as quickly as it could have. Now, more recently, there's been a lot more high quality work, beginning somewhat in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, and more just in this past decade, there's been some very high quality work, and that's when of course the International Astronomical Union became interested in archaeoastronomy, as well as accepting it as a full part of one of the subfields of astronomy. And the field has now emerged to the point where it's starting to need educational programs, which is why we started the one here at OU. It's the first of its kind in the world, but there's more that are coming along the way. So as far as Inca astronomy goes, I was able to benefit from Tom Zeidema's doctoral dissertation about the Seques and Wakas surrounding Cusco, and there were others who had done some research at individual sites, finding astronomical orientations. So I was able to benefit from all of that. No one pretty much, though, had done a comprehensive photo documentation of the light and shadow effects and the horizon events that I set out to find, that I had in my dissertation, and then of course much later in my book, and then just trying to tie them all together instead of examining, focusing in on just one particular site, trying to get a broader picture of what the Incas were doing was what I set out to do.
Very, very interesting. One last question, that this is not Inca, but it's Peru. What of the astronomical significance of the Nazca lines?
There's not a lot of accepted astronomical significance for them. Okay. It's more cultural. Certainly, astronomers, scientists don't think there were ancient astronauts that guided the development of the lines, but it was definitely a monumental feat for the culture that created those, to be able to create, to build those kind of images. And it's just speculated as to where they might have been able to climb high enough to be able to see what they were doing, but there's not really any belief that there was much astronomical significance of them.
Very good. Thank you very much. So we will, with that, bring to a close this event. Again, to remind you of some upcoming events, and also of an upcoming, not exactly event, but an experience. If you're a student at the University of Oklahoma and would like to visit some of the places that Dr. Gullberg illustrates in his book, there is a study abroad program that I am leading that will be traveling to Peru and to the mountains that are in the Cusco area, to Machu Picchu, also to the Amazonian region in the jungle in June of 2022. So keep that in mind if you have an interest in doing a study abroad course this coming summer. Closer to the present, we have next Thursday's Protecting Human Rights in the America presentation by George Lima. That's at noon. We have the Literature and Politics event on October 27th, and that's at 4:30. And on Friday, the 12th of November, at the same time as this event, today's event, at 3 p.m., we're going to have a panel presentation by 5 colleagues here at the University of Oklahoma who study various aspects of the Caribbean, Caribbean peoples, cultures, politics, literature, etc. And this is meant to be an introduction to Caribbean studies for many of us that are, although we're Latin Americanists, we're not always as familiar with what's going on in the world of the Caribbean. And so we've asked our colleagues to tell us about their work. And so I think that promises to be a very interesting event on November 12th. I'd like to thank Stephanie Homesager, who is the person who supports all of the work that we do at the Center for the Americas, and without which a lot of things wouldn't work very well. I'd also like to thank Maura McAndrew, who is responsible for the flyers that we get, and for Jessica Dobson, who helps disseminate information about these events. Thank you all for making this possible. Again, thank you, Professor Gullberg, for your presentation today. So we will now close this event. Thank you very much to everyone for attending.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.